In the final months before 22nd June 1941, food stood alongside oil and transport as a central determinant of strategy. German planners assessed that the Reich, with more than 80 million inhabitants including annexed territories, could not sustain a prolonged war under a renewed maritime blockade without external grain and fat supplies. Pre-war substitution and rationing had narrowed shortfalls but not removed them. The four-year plan organizations treated agriculture as a strategic sector comparable to steel. The Soviet Union, by contrast, entered 1941 with a collectivized farm system that had recovered from the shocks of the early 1930s and produced large surpluses in favored zones. In 1940, total Soviet grain harvests were on the order of tens of millions of tons, with the Ukrainian SSR contributing a significant share from Black Earth regions, and Belarus supplying rye, potatoes, and flax within a mixed agricultural belt. These aggregate figures shaped German expectations that the Western USSR could be made to provision both the Wehrmacht and the Reich economy. The policy architecture coalesced in spring 1941. State Secretary Herbert Backe in the Reich Ministry of Food and Agriculture, working with the Economic Staff East, WWII Stab Ost, and Göring's four-year plan offices, formulated what internal memoranda called the Food and Economic Policy for the East, later known as the Hunger Plan. The premises were explicit. Military operations would sever the Soviet economy, German authorities would extract the marketable surplus from the Black Earth Zone, and scarce transport would be directed first to the army, then to the Reich. This required separating surplus regions from deficit industrial centers such as Leningrad and Moscow. The plan anticipated severe urban shortages in those areas and accepted them as a predicted outcome of resource redirection rather than an operational failure. Military planning integrated these assumptions. Army Group South, with German and Allied formations totaling several 100,000 personnel at the frontier, advanced into the principal grain basin of Ukraine. Army Group Center, with comparable strength, drove towards Smolensk and beyond, across mixed farmland and forest. The Osttier overall deployed about 3.3 million Axis personnel on day one, with daily caloric and fodder requirements measured in thousands of tons, including bread grain, meat, fats, and oats for horse traction. Supply sections calculated that captured grain mills, bakeries, and local fodder would reduce strain on rail lift from the Reich. The Army's own directives encouraged early seizure of stocks, control of mills, and supervision of village deliveries through field commands and economic detachments. Transport was a binding constraint. German standard gauge of 1,435 millimeters met Soviet broad gauge of 1,524 millimeters at the border. Rail troops and organization TOT units prioritized conversion on corridors that connected the Dnieper basin to warehouses in the general government and East Prussia. Grain movement depended on the rapid repair of bridges, allocation of rolling stock suitable for bulk cargo, and functioning transshipment points where sacks could be weighed, sealed, and guarded. The general government, with established administrative apparatus and granaries, was slated to become a key hub for onward distribution to the Wehrmacht depots. On the Soviet side, pre-war contingency planning had identified food as both a civilian and military vulnerability. Grain procurements under the state order system stocked urban bakeries and Red Army depots. Emergency evacuation plans covered seed reserves and agricultural machinery. Collective and state farms were instructed to maintain sowing norms and reserve seed even under disruption. Intelligence estimates of a potential German invasion noted the likelihood of requisitions and the need to protect harvests. Local party committees and people's commissariats prepared for emergency threshing, guarded elevators, and the destruction or removal of stocks if necessary. Public sentiment and expectations diverged across regions. In the Reich, civilian rations had normalized the idea of shared sacrifice and reinforced perceptions that victory in the East would relieve pressure on domestic supplies. German soldiers, supplied with field rations whose caloric content varied by role and climate, were briefed that local sourcing would supplement the chain of depots. In Ukrainian and Belarusian countryside communities, the immediate pre-war months were marked by the ordinary cycle of sowing and by state deliveries. Memories of earlier shortages informed household strategies that balanced official quotas with private plots and informal exchange. None of these actors anticipated a rapid collapse of market and administrative mechanisms across thousands of kilometers. The administrative map that followed the front lines was designed for extraction as well as control. Military commander districts, Militärbefehlshaber, and economic inspectorates moved with the armies, while civilian occupation regimes were planned for rear areas, including the Reichskommissariat Ukraine and administrative districts attached to Army Group Center. These bodies were tasked to register harvests, set delivery quotas, and police trade. Grain accounting systems used by collective farms were to be replaced by German forms that tracked gross harvest and seed retention, fodder allowances, and the net marketable surplus claimable by authorities. At the level of calculation, the hunger plan translated into concrete numbers. Planners estimated that diverting a defined share of Ukrainian bread grain and fats could cover a significant fraction of Wehrmacht needs and allow shipments to the Reich that compensated for reduced imports from overseas. The same tables assumed a sharp contraction of caloric availability in Soviet industrial regions, now cut off from their food hinterlands. The projection was not limited to grain. Livestock drives, oil seed pressing, and dairy collection were included, with priorities tied to military movements and rail capacity. This framework was not a static blueprint. Economic Staff East Memoranda acknowledged uncertainties, weather affecting the 1941 harvest, battle damage to elevators and mills, the time required to restore rail service, and the reactions of rural producers whose labor and draft animals were essential for threshing and transport. German field commanders warned that premature seizures could disrupt sowing and reduce future yields, while food officials argued that frontline requirements justified immediate collection. Soviet countermeasures, including crop destruction, grain dumping, and evacuation of stocks, were recognized as variables that could reduce anticipated surpluses. By June 1941, the preconditions were therefore set on both sides. Germany planned a campaign whose supply concept relied in part on Eastern grain, with institutional mechanisms ready to register, collect, and move it. The Soviet Union entered the war with a centralized procurement system vulnerable to occupation, but still capable of mobilization and denial. Ukraine and Belarus, as agricultural zones with distinct crop profiles and transport networks, lay at the center of these intersecting designs. The economic contest over their harvests would unfold alongside military operations from the first weeks of the invasion, shaping the experience of soldiers and civilians, and determining the parameters within which later policies and outcomes would be measured. When the invasion began on 22 June 1941, food policy moved from paper tables to field orders. Army Group South's rear services entered western Ukraine behind mobile formations, attaching economic detachments to corps and armies. These groups, staffed by food officers, veterinary teams, and grain specialists, received directives to locate elevators, mills, and storage depots before regular administrative structures were established. Field commands issued standardized forms for seizure, with columns for gross quantity, moisture level, and inferred yield after drying. Similar routines followed Army Group Center into Belarus, where mixed rye and potato districts were mapped to delivery radii around railheads such as Brest, Baranovichi, and Orsha. The pace of movement meant that first seizures often targeted intact village stores and collective farm bins rather than large elevators, which were frequently damaged or burned during retreating actions. Initial reactions varied. Soviet district committees and NKPS rail officials implemented emergency procedures to remove or deny stocks. On 29 June 1941, government instructions prioritized evacuation of key industries and urged destruction of stores that could not be moved. Local cadres organized hasty threshing to rescue grain from fields threatened by fire or shelling, then buried sacks, flooded pits, or set elevator chutes alight. In Belarusian towns taken in late June and early July, German patrols documented elevators with charred galleries and seized only scattered sacks in adjacent warehouses. In the same weeks, German supply officers reported better results in Galicia, where many rural stores were captured undisturbed and could be moved by requisitioned carts to temporary collection points at rail sidings. Command structures took shape while the front advanced. The Economic Staff East coordinated with the Quartermaster General of the Army and the Reich Ministry of Food to synchronize seizure, milling, and shipment. In mid-July, the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories was formed to prepare civilian rule in rear areas, while the Army retained control of the requisition process in zones of operations. In practice, military and civilian authorities overlapped. Gebietskommissare drafted delivery schedules based on preliminary harvest estimates, while Army food offices assigned guards and transport. Orders reiterated a hierarchy of use. First, frontline rations and fodder. Second, Army bakeries and hospitals. Third, shipments to the Reich's supply net via the general government. Transport determined what could be realized. Rail conversion battalions worked behind the spearheads to bring broad-gauge lines into service for standard-gauge rolling stock. Typical capacities on reopened single-track lines remained limited by destroyed bridges and the scarcity of covered wagons suitable for grain. To avoid spoilage, food officers urged rapid drying and sacking before loading. When drying floors were absent, improvised kilns were built in courtyards using brick, sheet metal, and fuel scavenged from damaged workshops. On several corridors in July and August, in particular Lviv, Przemysl, and Brest-Biała Podlaska, grain moved in military trains intermixed with ammunition and fuel, with priority fluctuating according to the tactical situation. Village-level procedures followed a standard pattern. A field commandant summoned local elders and former collective farm bookkeepers, demanded production notebooks, and compiled a ledger of expected yield, seed reserve, fodder allowance, and the net delivery quota. Draft animals were inventoried along with wagons. Payment, when offered, took the form of occupation vouchers or receipts redeemable at regulated prices in a future administrative market. In some districts, barter was used. Salt, kerosene, and cloth were exchanged for grain, with rates set by the commandant and posted on village boards. Where units were in contact with the enemy or operating on poor roads, requisitions consisted of immediate collection from threshing floors with minimal paperwork. Soviet forces and civilians experienced these measures under different pressures. Red Army depots, tasked to provision large troop concentrations around key river lines, issued emergency rations while evacuating stock. Forward of bridges slated for demolition. In Belarus, depots near Mogilev and Balbruisk redistributed flour to field bakeries supporting units covering the Dnieper crossings. Civilians encountered curfews, identity checks, and bans on the sale of grain outside authorized channels. In towns, bakeries reopened under German supervision using seized flour, with posted ration scales for registered workers and officials. In the countryside, families balanced official delivery quotas with the need to retain seed and fodder, relying on kitchen gardens and hidden caches to hedge uncertainty. The first urban test came where advancing armies reached major cities. Smolensk, taken in mid-July, became an Army Group Center logistics hinge, but nearby elevators had suffered fire damage and required structural inspection before use. Kyiv, entered in September, after the encirclement on the Dnieper, offered intact mills on the left bank and damaged warehouses on the right, with bridges limiting cross-river movement. In both sectors, military bakery companies installed portable ovens to standardize bread issuance, measured in grams per person per day, according to duty category. Field veterinarians monitored fodder allocations for horse teams that hauled both artillery and grain, noting weight loss during long hauls on unmetalled roads. Administration adapted to the harvest calendar. As July turned to August, seizure procedures shifted from existing stores to standing crops. Cutting teams were formed under village supervision with quotas tied to daily cartage to collection points. Where combines were absent or fuel had been removed, harvesting relied on scythes and horse-drawn mowers, slowing throughput and raising losses. Grain moisture levels varied with weather. Wet harvest required extra drying time and increased spoilage risk. German reports from western Ukraine recorded delivery delays when threshing belts or bearings failed and replacement parts were unavailable, prompting cannibalization of machinery and the use of hand flails for emergency batches. Numbers entered the record as soon as shipments began. Army Group quartermasters logged tonnages by station and by 5-day period, comparing receipts with planned lifts. Deviations reflected combat priorities and line outages rather than a stable surplus flow. In Belarusian districts with mixed agriculture, requisitions included potatoes and fodder beets weighed in local units and converted into standard measures for reports. Butter and oilseed pressing were started on a limited scale where presses survived, with output directed to army hospitals and staff kitchens. Consumption tables for a corps-sized formation translated these inputs into daily rations for tens of thousands of personnel and thousands of horses. Resistance and avoidance appeared early, but within the opening phase remained localized and often covert. Households hid sacks in false walls or under floorboards. Threshing yields were understated. Delivery carts lost weight between field and siding. German commands responded with tighter weighing procedures, random re-inspections, and collective fines. In several districts, village assemblies negotiated quota reductions by demonstrating seed shortages or presenting livestock counts that implied higher fodder requirements. Where front lines were fluid, both sides drew from the same rural stores within weeks, compounding uncertainty for producers. By the end of October 1941, the opening phase had established the operational template: military seizure guided by central economic planning, shipment constrained by transport, and civilian subsistence narrowed by quota and market controls. The Wehrmacht's immediate needs received priority at collection points and mills. Soviet authorities, still operating in pockets and in the rear of new defensive lines, tried to evacuate, deny, or later reconstitute supplies. Ukraine and Belarus, divided by front movements and administrative zones, were integrated into distinct delivery networks that would define the patterns of grain flow and scarcity heading into the winter. Strategic goals hardened into administrative tables in midsummer 1941. For German authorities, the objective was twofold: provision the Osttier in situ and transfer a calculable surplus of bread grain, oil seeds, and animal fats to the Reich to offset blockade losses. The Economic Staff East and the Reich Ministry of Food translated this into regional targets. The Black Earth Zone of right bank and left bank Ukraine was assigned the principal burden for wheat and sunflower. Belarus, with mixed soils, was scheduled to deliver rye, potatoes, and flax. The northern forest belt was designated a low surplus area. Delivery quotas were expressed in gross tons per district, then netted after deducting seed norms and minimal fodder allowances. Administrative layers, Wirtschaftsinspektionen tied to army groups and food offices under field commands, were told to synchronize seizure, milling capacity, and rail lift so that shipments could begin before winter. The Wehrmacht's logistics doctrine assumed a stepwise chain from the railhead to the front. Heeresverpflegungsämter in the rear received bulk grain, while Feldbäckereikompanien milled or baked nearer the line. Horse traction, still critical for artillery and wagons, dictated parallel quotas for oats and hay. Daily allowance tables by duty category. Combat troops, support personnel, labor companies, specified gram weights for bread, meat, and fats. In planning, local procurement would reduce the strain on long-haul traffic from warehouses in the general government. Gauge conversion units projected reopening key corridors into Kiev, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk, with interim transshipment where bridges remained down. Civil occupation planning aimed to make these flows predictable. In the envisaged Reich Commissariat Ukraine, the hierarchy of Generalbezirk and Kreis was to register farms, set tax-in-kind deliveries, and reopen regulated markets where surplus could be exchanged under controlled prices. Gebietskommissare were instructed to keep seed reserves intact to secure the spring sowing, though field reports already warned that premature removals would depress the 1942 harvest. Administrative formulae for marketable surplus required accurate harvest measurement, but labor, draft animals, and machinery were all uncertain. Grain accounting therefore depended on village-level books inherited from collective farms, checked by German officers and interpreters against yields reported in previous years. Soviet objectives were the mirror image: preserve food for mobilization, evacuate or deny stocks in threatened zones, and maintain urban rations industrial centers while the Red Army regrouped. On 29 June 1941, a central directive ordered removal or destruction of stores critical to the enemy. People's commissariats instructed elevators to ship east by priority lists, while collective farms were to protect seed and tools. In major cities, bread supply was tied to defense factories, with ration scales revised for workers, dependents, and evacuees. The Red Army reorganized field bakeries and depots to follow new defensive lines, prioritizing forces around key river barriers and rail junctions. Both sides miscalculated. German planners overestimated immediate surpluses by assuming the 1941 harvest could be reaped, threshed, and dried on schedule under occupation conditions. Cutting teams lacked fuel for combines, broken belts and bearings halted threshers, and cartage suffered from requisitioned horses and damaged roads. Moisture content rose where cutting was delayed by combat or rain, increasing drying time and spoilage risk. Field commands discovered that the administrative act of setting quotas did not create the transport, sacks, or millstones to realize them. Rail conversion proceeded, but single-track capacity, bridge outages, and wagon shortages limited bulk movement. When flour had to be hauled by horse wagon from village mills to depots, consumption by draft animals grew into a measurable deduction from the same grain flow intended to relieve German fodder demand. Soviet calculations likewise strained under conditions of retreat. Rapid evacuation moved people faster than tools. Some elevators loaded out only a fraction of their stocks before demolition charges were set. Destroyed or burnt stores met policy, but they also deprived remaining civilians and retreating units. Attempts to protect seed reserves clashed with immediate hunger in frontline districts, and ad hoc distribution under fire produced uneven outcomes across neighboring villages. The goal of sustaining urban bread rations clashed with rail priorities for ammunition and troop movements, especially where lines were already running at reduced speed under air attack. Propaganda framed planning, but could not resolve its frictions. German proclamations in towns announced reopening of markets and promised stable prices once deliveries met quotas, presenting extraction as administrative normalization. Leaflets contrasted planned deliveries with alleged Soviet hoarding, seeking rural compliance. Soviet political departments issued instructions to emphasize the legitimacy of emergency requisition and the duty to deny resources to the enemy, while newspapers documented evacuation work and lauded elevator crews who saved stocks. In the countryside of Ukraine and Belarus, producers encountered both narratives and judged them against immediate facts. Who had control of the nearest station? Which side provided salt, kerosene, and simple tools, and how much seed would remain for the next sowing? Operational timing shaped outcomes. The main harvest window in the forest steppe fell in August and early September. The longer the fighting disrupted cutting and threshing, the smaller the net surplus regardless of policy. German commands attempted to bring harvest labor under patrol protection and to stage cart columns to collection points, but manpower was limited, and units were pulled forward by the front. Soviet authorities sought to strip elevators ahead of advancing columns, then relied on smaller caches and mobile bakeries in the rear of new defensive belts. In both systems, documentation, stocks, inflows, outflows, degraded under pressure, turning the grain economy into a set of approximations where tonnage estimates diverged from receipts at railheads. At staff level, both sides updated plans as field reports arrived. The Economic Staff East revised district quotas downward in zones with heavy damage and directed more attention to oilseed pressing, where small installations could be revived quickly. Some German commands experimented with barter to elicit voluntary delivery, assigning fixed exchange rates for salt, textiles, and kerosene. Soviet commissariats issued additional instructions to protect seed and intensified penalties for unauthorized sale of grain. As winter approached, each system focused on continuity. For the Wehrmacht, maintaining daily rations and fodder under cold weather demands. For the Soviet side, stabilizing bread supply to mobilized cities and armies while restoring sowing capacity for spring. The strategic intent on both sides remained consistent, But the mechanics, labor, tools, horses, rolling stock, bridges, and time set the limits within which those intentions could be realized. Field operations in July and August 1941 brought the food economy into direct contact with fighting formations. In Belarus, Army Group Center's drive toward the Dnieper and Smolensk created large pockets where rear services moved almost as quickly as combat echelons. Panzer Group II and parts of the Fourth Army reached the Dnieper crossings near Orsha and Mogilev in the first half of July, while Soviet 13th and 20th Armies attempted to hold bridgeheads. As the Smolensk battle formed between July 10th and early September, German field bakeries attached to corps-level supply bases issued standardized bread rations to tens of thousands of troops per day, supported by local mills that resumed work under guard. In the same districts, Soviet depots evacuated flour east of the river and destroyed stocks that could not be moved. Civilians in towns newly captured by German forces registered for ration cards tied to employment categories. Initial scales posted in several county seats specified bread allotments in the range of 200 to 400 grams per day for registered workers, with lower levels for dependents until deliveries stabilized. Where front lines shifted, temporary suspensions of sales were announced until weighing and inventory were verified. In Ukraine, the first large encirclement south of Kyiv at Uman in late July and early August removed Soviet formations from the agricultural belt between Vinnytsia and Uman, and opened roads to the central right bank region. German 17th Army and Panzer Group I closed the pocket against elements of Soviet 6th and 12th Armies. The collapse permitted rear services to map storage sites along tributaries of the southern Bug, and to requisition carts for transfers to railheads at Jamarinka and Proskuriv. Grain moved in mixed trains with fuel and ammunition because dedicated freight schedules were not yet available. Rural producers met summons at village councils with delivery quotas expressed in poods and converted by German officers to metric tons. Payments and occupation vouchers began to circulate but were not accepted beyond controlled markets, leading to a dual economy where barter for salt or kerosene coexisted with formal receipts. Army Group Center's encirclement around Smolensk, which netted large numbers of Soviet prisoners from late July into August, created an immediate demand for food inside temporary camps. Allocation tables diverted part of local requisitions to these sites. Soviet attempts to break out kept rail lines under interdiction. Damaged bridges at Orsha and across the Dnieper reduced throughput to single-track ferry crossings. Grain awaiting shipment accumulated in warehouses near the tracks, increasing spoilage risk when drying floors were inadequate. German reports from district food offices recorded moisture content above acceptable levels in several batches, triggering redrying and losses expressed as a percentage of net usable weight. Kyiv remained a major fulcrum for both logistics systems. Through August, Southwestern Front maintained a supply net on the left bank of the Dnieper, while preparing for a potential withdrawal. German forces bridged river barriers to the north and south, and, in September, executed the encirclement that resulted in the capture of the city on September 19th. The fall of Kyiv transferred intact milling capacity in several districts to German control, but bridge damage still constrained movement of flour between banks. Urban registration restarted under occupation authorities, who tied bread rations to work assignments in municipal services and rail workshops. In the surrounding oblasts, field teams set quotas based on preliminary harvest estimates. Village assemblies disputed deductions for seed and fodder, presenting livestock counts that implied specific winter feed needs. Some concessions were granted. Others were rejected with the warning that unmet quotas would be rolled forward and collected in kind from communal assets. Unexpected outcomes accompanied the first months of seizure. German planners had anticipated larger early surpluses from captured elevators, but scorched elevators at key nodes in Belarus, including installations with charred galleries and warped grain chutes, reduced initial receipts. In western Ukraine, where combat passed quickly, more intact stores were found, yet cartage to railheads lagged because draft animals had been taken by both armies. Fodder allocations, designed to support horse traction for artillery and supply columns, consumed part of the same grain flow that quotas intended to export, especially on long hauls over unmetalled roads. For Soviet authorities, efforts to keep urban bread supply stable in industrial centers such as Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk competed with troop movements on the same lines, and railway timetables recorded priority shifts in favor of ammunition or evacuations on specific days, with flour trains held in sidings. Civilian behavior adjusted to the new conditions. In towns, inhabitants registered for ration cards to access regulated bakeries, but continued to rely on small kitchen plots and informal exchange for vegetables and fats. In the countryside, families preserved seed grain in concealed containers and presented lower threshing yields to reduce quotas. German commands introduced random re-inspections and weighbridge checks at collection points and imposed collective fines when discrepancies were detected. Soviet partisans, forming in forested areas of Belarus and Polesia, monitored grain flows to rail and conducted small-scale sabotage against bridges and storehouses, which forced German escorts to increase guard allocations and slowed the tempo of shipments. Comparative figures illustrate the scale of demand and movement in the opening engagements. A German infantry division of approximately 15,000 to 17,000 personnel required several tens of tons of bread grain equivalents per day, plus additional fodder for horse teams, numbering in the thousands. A Soviet army defending a river line, with 80,000 to 120,000 personnel, drew daily flour allocations from forward depots, calculated to sustain field bakeries near corps headquarters and rifle divisions. When bridges fell, both sides shifted to road haulage, which increased losses due to spillage and consumption by animals. The presence of large encircled groups around Smolensk in July, August, and around Kyiv in September temporarily redirected local food stocks toward prisoner sustenance and guard units, reducing availability for immediate shipment or civilian sale. Territorial change altered the administrative map of collection. Belarusian districts west of the Dnieper were integrated into Army Group Center's rear area by August. Ukrainian right bank oblasts north of the southern Bug fell under Army Group South's economic inspectorates by early September. Each new boundary brought a new set of ledgers, seals, and forms. German offices replaced Soviet collective farm books with standardized sheets listing gross harvest, deductions, and net quota. Translators verified names and fields. Veterinary teams counted livestock to calculate fodder deductions. On the Soviet side, new defensive lines around Bryansk and along the lower Dnieper created hinterlands where remaining depots and bakeries reorganized, issuing priority rations to factory workers and construction battalions engaged in fortification. Morale followed these practical measures rather than proclamations. German soldiers encountered functioning bakeries in some towns and empty storehouses in others, and unit diaries recorded days of full rations and days of reductions. Soviet troops noted bread quality variation as depots shifted mills and flour sources. Civilians weighed receipts and promises against visible deliveries. By late September 1941, the pattern of the clash phase was set. Combat generated pockets and ruptures. Rear services pursued grain along reopened lines, and households navigated between quotas, rations, and hidden reserves. The convergence of military movements and the harvest calendar created a narrow window in which seizures could be translated into transportable surpluses. Once the window closed with autumn rains and damaged bridges, both systems faced rising costs to convert available harvest into usable food for armies and cities entering the winter. Autumn 1941 shifted the food contest into a prolonged crisis that widened as fronts extended and administration solidified. After Kyiv's capture on 19 September and Kharkiv's on 24 October, military rear areas stretched over agricultural belts whose harvests were only partly secured. Rasputitia conditions slowed cartage and rail repairs. Moisture levels in unthreshed grain rose, and potatoes lifted late from fields froze in transit when protective straw and cellaring were insufficient. Army Group Center's October encirclements near Vyozma and Bryansk increased local consumption by formations consolidating lines, while Army Group South's advance toward the lower Dnieper and Donetsk detached additional rural districts from Soviet procurement nets. Each gain in territory produced a new set of ledgers, but not the sacks, wagons, and bridge capacity required to meet earlier tonnage assumptions. Command tensions intensified as winter approached. The Wehrmacht's quartermasters demanded priority for front rations and fodder, citing daily needs for a core sector measured in tens of tons of flour and several tons of fats, plus several tons of oats and hay for thousands of horses. The economic staff east pressed for exportable surpluses to the Reich, where civilian rations depended on compensating for lost overseas imports. Civil authorities under the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, now organizing the Reich Commissariat Ukraine and General Bezirk Weißruthenian, argued that seed and minimal peasant subsistence had to be protected to avoid a reduced 1942 harvest. District orders alternated between collection drives and temporary exemptions for seed and fodder. In practice, unit proximity to force and transport often decided outcomes more than decrees. Urban systems displayed stress signals first. In occupied cities of right bank Ukraine, bakeries operated under posted scales that linked bread allotments to employment categories, with ranges adjusted downward in November and December, when scheduled deliveries fell short. In Belarusian towns, mill output fluctuated with power supply and grain moisture. Ration queues lengthened when wagons failed to arrive from rural collection points. The general government to the west functioned as a relay hub. Warehouses near Lublin and Krakow received mixed shipments of grain and flour from the east, and dispatched part onward to the Reich's internal network, while also provisioning Wehrmacht depots. Rail dispatch tables recorded days when food trains stood aside for ammunition, or engineer stores needed at bridge sites, altering the rhythm of bakery output in downstream cities. Soviet supply policy confronted the same constraints with different aims. Evacuation of elevators and seed reserves continued through October, but distances to the Volga and Urals, and the need to prioritize armaments traffic, limited food flows from former Western procurement zones. Urban ration scales in the unoccupied industrial centers were revised several times between September and December, increasing allocations for defense workers and reducing those for dependents. Red Army depots reconstituted behind new defensive lines drew flour from interior mills. Temporary shortages at forward bakeries appeared when trains were delayed, or when newly built ovens lacked spare parts. In front sectors opposite Army Group Center and South, commanders reported bread variation by a day, reflecting the fragility of the new eastward supply lines. The agricultural calendar compressed options. Where threshing was incomplete by late October, wet grain required drying floors that no longer existed at scale after elevator damage. Improvised kilns consumed fuel needed elsewhere, and part of the harvest remained unusable until frost reduced insect risk but increased breakage losses. Seed accounting grew contentious. German district offices sought to cap seed retention to realize quotas, while village assemblies presented rotations and livestock numbers to justify higher reserves. Some districts granted percentage-based seed norms. Others converted seed into a loan with a scheduled return after spring sowing. Reports noted that excessive seed removal would lower the 1942 output, but immediate military requirements continued to dominate decisions near active fronts. Horse traction became a binding variable for both systems. A German infantry division used hundreds to more than 1,000 draft animals for wagons, artillery, and supply. Each animal required multiple kilograms of fodder daily. On long hauls over unmetalled roads, fodder loads consumed capacity intended for grain, and animals lost condition in freezing temperatures when shelter and feed were inadequate. Soviet transport columns with horse teams faced similar arithmetic as they shifted depots east and supported defensive works. Veterinary services on both sides organized cut fodder stations and issued ration tables for animals by task category. Yet winter losses measured in thousands across wide sectors reduced haulage and forced additional requisitions of oats that directly competed with bread grain. Security conditions escalated. Partisan groups in Belarus and northern Ukraine targeted sidings, bridges, and grain stores, using small charges to delay trains or destroy sacks. German commands increased guard allocations and instituted convoy schedules with fixed checkpoints, which reduced throughput elsewhere due to limited manpower. Collective penalties for missing deliveries, including additional quotas or confiscation of communal assets, appeared in district orders. On the Soviet side, security troops escorted evacuation trains and imposed controls on private trade near railheads to prevent diversion from official channels. These measures imposed administrative costs measured in personnel diverted from other tasks and in time lost at additional inspections. Casualty patterns shaped demand curves. In October-December 1941, major engagements near Tula, Rostov, and along the Dnieper consumed ammunition and medical stores. Evacuation of wounded required hospital rations in both systems that were higher in protein and fats than standard scales. Prisoner of war camps, which multiplied after encirclements, absorbed a share of local food stocks under guard authority. The result was a reallocation inside the same finite grain basin. Frontline rations, hospital diets, guard units, and prisoner sustenance each claimed priority on different days, producing variability in city bakeries and village markets. International observation registered the outlines of the crisis without precision. Neutral and allied analysts used rail movement data from the general government, consular reporting from neighboring states, and refugee accounts to estimate that German authorities were redirecting surplus from Western Soviet agricultural zones while urban centers cut rations. These assessments informed debates about future relief or sanctions, but could not alter the immediate arithmetic of bridges, rolling stock, and available grain. By January 1942, the escalation phase had produced a stable pattern of scarcity governed by infrastructure and season. German administrations reported that district quotas were met in some right bank oblasts with early harvest completion, but lagged in Belarusian mixed farm regions, where transport and security issues were persistent. Soviet authorities restored minimum bread supply in several industrial cities by rerouting interior shipments, but acknowledged uneven distribution evacuation hubs and frontline garrisons. For rural households across occupied Ukraine and Belarus, winter survival depended on the balance among official deliveries, hidden caches, kitchen gardens, and access to fuel for cooking. The crisis thus became systemic. Policies on paper remained consistent, but the limiting factors, labor, animals, sacks, kilns, locomotives, bridges, and hours of daylight, fixed the ceiling on how much grain could be converted into bread for armies and civilians on either side of the line. The height of extraction coincided with the largest operations of 1942. On June 28, 1942, the German summer campaign opened toward the Don, Volga, and Caucasus. Army Group South split into A and B in July, stretching front lines across grain belts from Kharkiv through the Donets to the lower Don and into the Kuban. Rear services expanded collection networks in right bank and left bank Ukraine, while establishing provisional depots farther east along the Donets corridor. Civil authorities in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine standardized district ledgers and imposed quarterly delivery schedules in wheat, rye, and sunflower. In Belarus, Army Group Center maintained mixed rye and potato quotas, while allocating additional rail guards as partisan activity intensified along the Orsha-Smolensk and Brest-Baranovichi lines. Quantities were expressed in operational terms. A field ration scale that issued 600 grams of bread per soldier per day implied 150 tons of bread grain, equivalents for an army of 250,000 personnel. Horse traction remained decisive. 30,000 draft animals at 5 kilograms of oats per day required roughly 150 tons of fodder daily. Corps quartermasters translated these requirements into train paths, with 20-ton covered wagons. A day's bread for such a force equated to about 8 wagons after milling losses were accounted for, while fodder demanded comparable lift. These calculations set targets for district offices that manage threshing crews, drying floors, and sacking teams. In Ukraine, medium-sized mills in Kyiv, Bila Tserkva, and Poltava resumed standardized output under posted moisture and ash tolerances. Bakeries near Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk ran on staggered shifts tied to power availability and rail receipts. Transport at peak load combined rail and river, On the Dnieper, barges moved bulk grain to river ports that could transship to standard gauge wagons west of major bridge outages. On the Azov coast, coastal craft carried sacks between Mariupol and Taganrog when road routes were congested, with cargoes weighed and sealed by depot clerks before loading. Rail conversion continued eastward in segments, but single-track operations and bridge repairs limited frequency. Dispatchers balanced ammunition, fuel, and food trains. When engineer stores were prioritized for bridge projects, food consignment stood in loops, raising spoilage risk in summer heat. Reports from district food offices recorded increased loss percentages for high-moisture batches and recommended additional drying time that in practice competed with labor needed for harvesting. At the village level, the peak campaign condensed administrative routines into daily tasks. Harvest brigades cut and carted to threshing sites where belts, bearings, and fuel had to be supplied from limited stocks. Drying floors were rebuilt from brick and sheet metal using timber salvaged from damaged structures. Seed norms for autumn sowing were calculated against rotations and field sizes recorded in updated ledgers. Veterinary teams weighed horses and adjusted fodder rations by work category, noting weight loss during long hauls. Payment combined occupation vouchers with controlled barter, salt, kerosene, needles, and cloth issued against receipts at fixed exchange rates. In several districts, authorities experimented with mobile purchasing columns to reduce farmer travel time, but additional guards and clerks limited their range. Soviet supply and denial measures reached their own peak. Fronts opposite Army Group Center and South drew flour from interior mills along the Volga and in the Urals. Temporary depots near Voronezh and along the middle, Don fed field bakeries of rifle divisions and tank corps during July-August engagements. As German advances approached the Don Bend and the lower Volga, evacuation orders extended to remaining elevators and presses in the path of Army Group B. Where removal was infeasible, demolition teams rendered machinery unusable. Local party bodies directed emergency threshing and accelerated seed protection. In Belarus, small detachments maintained supply to partisan bases using pack transport, rafts, and short-haul carts, accepting higher loss rates to preserve food for fighters and dependents. Urban centers under occupation and in the Soviet rear recorded the concentration of resources typical of a peak campaign. In occupied Kyiv and Kharkiv, ration scales linked bread to registered employment in rail workshops, utilities, and municipal services, with unregistered residents eligible for lower allotments or compelled to purchase at controlled prices when available. In Minsk and regional towns west of the Dnieper, mixed rations combining bread, potatoes, and soup components reflected the crop profile of nearby districts. In the Soviet rear, Stalingrad and industrial cities on the Volga revised scales for defense workers and garrison troops. Rail congestion during August and September produced day-to-day variation in bread weight that unit logs recorded. Security commitments rose with volume. Grain convoys to major railheads required escorts along road sections, where small sabotage teams cut traces or scattered loads. Bahnschutz and Army patrols established checkpoint intervals measured in kilometers. Each additional guard reduced labor available for harvesting or mill operation. In Belarus, rail sabotage expanded from isolated cuts to repeated attacks on the same vulnerable spans, forcing rerouting and the creation of repair reserves, including timber, spikes, and tools, that competed for rolling stock space with food consignments. German district orders introduced collective penalties for missed quotas and offered limited incentives, such as kerosene allocations, for early delivery. Soviet commands reinforced bridge guards on interior lines and restricted private trade within defined zones around depots to prevent diversion. Medical and prisoner systems absorbed a larger share of food during the peak. Field hospitals near major axes required diets with additional fats and protein. Procurement officers assigned meat and dairy from local deliveries before calculating residual grain for export. Prisoner of war camps grew around the Don and in rear areas of Army Group Center. Guard authorities requisitioned part of local stocks for camp kitchens. The allocation sequence, front rations, hospitals, guards, prisoners, export, shifted by day with operational needs, but the cumulative effect was constant pressure on rural deliveries. Administrative integration reached its highest degree in mid-1942. The Reich Commissariat, Ukraine's General Bezirka, established regular reporting cycles with tonnage targets by month. Army Group quartermasters consolidated depot accounts to detect route bottlenecks, and the general government's warehouses around Lublin and Chelm served as relay hubs for shipments onward to the Reich and to front depots. Documentation improved compared to the first winter. Moisture content, drying losses, and milling yields appeared in standardized forms. Discrepancies triggered re-inspections rather than ad hoc fines. Yet limits remained. Labor availability, animal strength, bagging material, and wagon cycles fixed ceilings on throughput regardless of plans. For rural households, the peak translated into compressed margins. Delivery days increased in frequency, inspections grew more systematic, and barter markets operated under tighter controls. Households managed between quota, seed retention, and fodder for remaining livestock, while kitchen gardens and small livestock provided supplementary calories. In districts exposed to partisan warfare, or close to shifting fronts, risk-adjusted strategies favored concealed reserves and reduced declared yields at the cost of higher inspection frequency. For both systems, the peak season clarified the dependency graph that had developed since 1941. The transformation of a sown hectare into bread for an infantry company or fodder for a horse team required uninterrupted sequences: labor, fuel, belts, sacks, guards, wagons, locomotives, bridges, that could be measured, scheduled, and, when interrupted, traced to specific points of failure. Adaptation began at the point where plans met shortage. German food administrations revised procedures district by district in early 1942. Ledgers shifted from seasonal to quarterly targets. Inspectors standardized sampling of moisture, ash, and infestation. And depots introduced rotating quality checks to prevent spoilage in long queues at railheads. Bahnschutzes detachments added patrols on vulnerable stretches, while railway directorates installed heavier guards at bridges and culverts. Convoy doctrine for road haulage specified escort intervals and rest stops, with rations for drivers and horses calculated to minimize diversion from cargo. Incentives appeared beside penalties. Some districts exchanged salt, kerosene, and cloth at fixed rates for on-time delivery, and posted schedules aligned to threshing cycles. Where mills lacked power, generator sets were mounted on trucks, or small steam engines were rebuilt with scavenged parts, allowing limited output near the front without using rail capacity. Soviet adaptation in threatened and occupied zones combined denial with local provision. Commanders authorized partisan detachments to mine rail lines with delayed charges and to cut telegraph lines in selected sectors, forcing detours without prolonged firefights. Field bakeries behind the front converted to fuel mixes that included wood blocks and low-quality coal, and deputy commissariats assigned welding teams to keep belts and bearings in service. Evacuation hubs formed along the Volga, Kama, and Ural lines, where flour was rebagged and dispatched to fronts, with priority for armies defending river crossings and industrial centers. In occupied countryside, clandestine networks cached seed in sealed containers buried at known markers. Households organized night milling with small stones or hand grinders to avoid detection, while preserving bread-making continuity. Partisan organization scaled with terrain. In Belarus woodlands and marsh, detachments maintained depots reachable by pack transport. Numerical strength varied by district and month, but by late 1942, some brigades fielded several hundred fighters with support personnel in the hinterland. Their immediate objective was not to seize large stocks, but to raise the cost of movement. Typical actions included removing rail fish plates on secondary lines, placing small charges under culverts, and ambushing grain carts near predictable choke points like ferry landings. Combined with reconnaissance, this forced German commands to allocate additional guards and to redesign schedules around daylight. Reducing daily tonnage moved even when no ambush occurred. In right bank Ukraine, open steppe favored temporary interdiction of roads rather than permanent sanctuaries. groups exploited fog and evening traffic to scatter loads or to force escorts to dismount. German countermeasures reflected these pressures. Security divisions, police regiments, and locally raised auxiliaries conducted sweep operations that combined cordon, search, and registration. When rail incidents persisted on a line for several days, traffic officers mandated block movement, with trains only entering a section after confirmation from the forward post. Grain depots installed double fencing and limited entry to workers with stamped passes. To reduce pilferage and underreporting at collection points, weighing scales were recalibrated under supervision, and random backweighing was introduced at the next station. Veterinary officers standardized horse ration tables by task class and required weight checks to preserve draft capacity over long campaigns. Civilians adapted within narrow margins. Families reorganized labor to meet both quota and survival tasks, moving threshing and drying to mornings when patrols were less frequent and grinding to late night. Kitchen gardens increased the share of potatoes and cabbage. Pigs and chickens were kept in smaller numbers to reduce fodder needs. Receipts in occupation currency were accepted at regulated markets, but not in informal exchange, which continued to favor salt, soap, and needles. Where inspection regimes tightened, declared yields fell, and hidden stores grew riskier. Households responded by dispersing caches into smaller units across several sites, and by coordinating deliveries among relatives to match posted schedules. Innovation was often incremental. In districts short of sacks, depots issued reused bags with repaired seams and set aside needle and thread as part of the exchange list. Small oilseed presses were reassembled, with improvised gaskets to produce a limited flow of sunflower oil for hospital kitchens and bakery lubricants. Where belt drives failed, threshing crews returned to hand flails for emergency batches despite higher losses, bridged by instructions on drying times to reduce mold. German field bakeries experimented with admixtures, blending rye and barley to extend wheat supplies while holding ash content within tolerance. Soviet rear mills experimented with potato flour blends during acute shortages, keeping bread weight stable while caloric content shifted. Psychological effects followed logistics. German unit diaries in early and mid-1942 recorded alternating days of full and reduced bread issues tied to rail delays, and the tone of entries shifted with the predictability of delivery. Commands increased briefings to explain ration scales and to link field discipline to supply, aiming to stabilize morale during long hauls and static periods. Soviet reports from interior cities noted bread quality fluctuations and detailed the sequence of queue management and distribution, emphasizing priority for defense workers. In occupied towns, ration cards tied to employment reinforced incentives to seek registered work in rail shops, utilities, and municipal services, while unregistered residents relied on controlled prices that varied with arrivals from rural depots. Adaptation also reshaped documentation. German offices compiled moisture and loss tables by district, noting higher loss percentages in summers with delayed cutting. Ledger formats included columns for seed, fodder, and residual quota, with signatures from both the inspector and village bookkeeper, a practice intended to deter later disputes. Soviet procurement in the rear converted to more dynamic reporting, with rolling 5-day plans linked to rail performance and diversion orders that anticipated bridge works or air raids. Both systems thereby reduced the gap between plan and outcome, though neither eliminated the structural constraints imposed by distance and damage. Counter-adaptation continued on the other side. Partisans learned inspection routines and adjusted timing. When block movement created predictable pauses, rail teams set charges on the last wagons to maximize disruption and to immobilize the section while repairs were underway. German escorts, in turn, shifted to irregular patterns and deployed small armored draisines on susceptible stretches. When village inspections focused on threshing floors, clandestine milling moved to remote barns and wooded clearings. When German barter lists attracted voluntary deliveries in one district, Soviet partisan command directed pressure against those routes to increase perceived risk and to reduce net flow. By late 1942 and early 1943, these adaptations settled into recognizable patterns. Grain moved in smaller, more secure packets on roads and in guarded blocks on rails. Mills operated with intermittent power, and prioritized military bakery orders. Households balanced quota and concealment with seed and fodder. Partisan activity forced escorts and repairs, raising the labor cost per ton moved. Administration converted learning into regulation, with more precise tables and narrower discretion at local offices. The result was not a decisive advantage for either side, but a tempered system in which each new unit of bread or fodder required more steps, more signatures, and more guards than in the opening year. Within that system, the capacity to adapt by repairing a belt, reallocating a guard, or revising a schedule by one day, often determined whether a battalion's bread arrived on time or whether a village retained enough seed to plant the next season. The decisive shift came between November 1942 and autumn 1943, when the balance of movement and control over grain regions reversed. On 19 November 1942, Soviet forces opened the Stalingrad counteroffensive. By late November, formations of the Red Army closed a ring around German 6th Army and parts of 4th Panzer Army. The encirclement transformed food arithmetic at the front. Inside the pocket, bread issues fell as airlift tonnage failed to match daily requirements. Outside, Army Group Don and Army Group A recalculated rations and fodder for covering forces withdrawing from the Caucasus and the Lower Don in December 1942 to February 1943. German rear services diverted flour and oats to mobile reserves tasked with holding crossings, reducing exports westward and tightening allotments in occupied cities. When the 6th Army surrendered in late January and early February 1943, the Red Army integrated captured flour stocks and ovens into its own supply for local garrisons, while German administrations west of the Donets reported immediate shortfalls in planned deliveries. The retreat from the Caucasus and the Donets in early 1943 redefined control over agricultural belts. German evacuation orders included food and draft animals, but road and rail capacity could not absorb both troops and rural assets. In practice, removal concentrated on processed stores, flour and oilseed cakes, that could be loaded quickly. Standing crops were absent and winter fodder was heavy. Destruction orders targeted mills and presses to delay reuse. As Army Group South fell back toward Kharkiv in February-March 1943, district ledgers were closed with partial balances. Quotas for the first quarter went unmet in several left bank oblasts. Shipment records from relay hubs in the general government showed reduced arrivals compared to late 1942. The Red Army, advancing over ground with damaged elevators, relied on interior mills and emergency field bakeries, while Soviet civil authorities deployed seed inspectors to protect spring sowing in recaptured districts. Spring 1943 exposed the limits of extraction under sustained retreat. German economic offices attempted to reset targets in right bank Ukraine, where sowing still promised a summer harvest. Seed allowances were recalculated from autumn reserves and surviving livestock numbers. Field officers warned that removal beyond agreed norms would reduce yields. Partisan activity in Belarus intensified along the Minsk, Smolensk, and Brest-Baranowicki corridors, with repeated cuts and bridge fires that raised escort requirements. Railway directorates introduced block movement and doubled guard posts, but wagon cycles lengthened. Tonnage lifted per week to relay warehouses west of the Bug fell when dispatchers prioritized ammunition for mobile operations around Belgorod and Kharkiv in March and April. The Kursk operation fixed the turning point in mid-1943. German forces assembled for an offensive in July that concentrated fuel and ammunition. Food trains to forward depots were scheduled, but reserves for civil rations and export were reduced to clear paths for operational cargo. When the offensive failed and Soviet counteroffensives opened from July into August, Army Group South and Army Group Center faced prolonged withdrawals. District authorities in right bank Ukraine initiated emergency harvest programs to move wheat and rye before new defensive lines formed on the Dnieper. Mobile purchasing columns and requisitioned carts collected grain to river ports and railheads. But crossings were contested and bridges were destroyed. Records from August-September show growing shares of unthreshed grain left in fields as frontline movements overtook harvest teams. On the Soviet side, the The same months marked the restoration of a continuous provisioning chain to the west. Interior mills along the Volga and in the Urals increased dispatches to fronts advancing toward the Dnieper, and newly recovered elevators were surveyed for rapid reactivation. Seed commissions certified reserves in retaken villages. Where reserves were missing, emergency seed loans were issued from regional stocks. Urban ration scales in liberated cities were set for garrisons and essential workers, with lower scales for dependents until local deliveries restarted. Field bakeries followed corps and army headquarters, using captured or repaired ovens where possible. By September-November 1943, the Dnieper crossings transformed the map of grain control. German commands attempted to remove stores from the left bank and to establish new quotas west of the river. Evacuation lists prioritized flour, oil, and preserved meat. Fodder was moved only where horse teams could haul without halting troop columns. As Soviet bridgeheads multiplied from the north near Loev to the south near Dnipropetrovsk, collection zones narrowed to areas directly accessible to secure railheads. Kyiv, entered by Soviet forces on November 6, 1943, shifted a major milling node out of German hands. With each major city lost, German export capacity contracted, and local occupation markets dissolved or relocated. Comparative figures illustrate the inflection. A German field army attempting to hold a river line with 300,000 personnel and tens of thousands of horses required daily bread and fodder measured in hundreds of tons. Wagon cycles across damaged bridges could not maintain both ammunition and food flows at required rates once crossings were reduced to ferries or temporary spans. Soviet armies of comparable size, advancing on multiple axes, drew on interior rail systems with growing redundancy. New depots on the right bank shortened road hauls and reduced fodder consumption per ton delivered. In Belarus, the summer-autumn 1943 expansion of partisan forces increased the number of rail incidents recorded per week, affecting German movements from Smolensk toward Orsha and Vitebsk. Administrative choices reflected the turning point. German economic offices reduced export targets to the Reich in the fourth quarter of 1943 and concentrated on sustaining front rations and selected urban rations in the remaining occupation zones. Some districts introduced accelerated barter to elicit deliveries before withdrawal, offering higher rates for salt and kerosene. Others imposed one-time confiscations from communal assets. The Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories issued guidance to preserve seed and livestock where possible, but forced marches and demolitions often overrode directives. Soviet civil authorities, in contrast, widened procurement nets in liberated areas and integrated them with rear commissariats, setting modest quotas to support local recovery while meeting front requirements. The consequences for rural households followed these movements. In zones of German retreat, inspections intensified before evacuations. Families destroyed or dispersed caches rather than surrender stores to last-minute convoys. In newly liberated zones, seed and tool shortages were common. Committees organized repair of threshers and mills, and households received seed loans to meet sowing windows. In Belarusian districts still under occupation, the density of patrols rose with rail interdiction, tightening control over markets and movement, while reducing net deliveries as escorts absorbed manpower. By the end of 1943, the turning point was complete. German forces held fewer agricultural districts, with diminished capacity to export grain beyond immediate military use. Front rations were maintained in many sectors, but urban scales in occupied territories narrowed. Soviet forces regained key milling centers and river crossings, re-established procurement in large parts of Ukraine, and set conditions for broader recovery in 1944. The logistics of bread and fodder reflected the strategic map. The side advancing across repaired rails and reopened bridges increased tonnage to armies and cities. The side withdrawing along broken lines faced higher losses, shorter planning horizons, and a contracting base of collection. Combat operations in Ukraine and Belarus ended in stages that corresponded to the collapse of German control over agricultural districts. In right bank Ukraine, Soviet forces crossed the Dnieper in autumn 1943 and continued west in the first half of 1944. In Belarus, Operation Bagration opened on 23 June 1944, and by early August reached the Nieman and Vistula. German rear services executed evacuation and denial measures while withdrawing. Removal lists prioritized flour, oilseed cakes, preserved meat, and transportable livestock. Destruction orders targeted remaining elevators, mills, and presses. Where time permitted, machinery was dismantled or rendered inoperable. When under pressure, fires were set in storage floors. Road and rail capacity limited execution. Columns transporting ammunition, wounded, and command staffs had priority, so food removal was uneven across districts. Many villages saw last-day inspections in which delivery arrears were converted to confiscations of communal assets rather than collected through regular ledgers. Soviet reoccupation brought immediate provisioning tasks for garrisons, returning authorities, and civilians. Field bakeries followed armies into cities such as Vinnytsia, Zhytomyr, and Minsk within days of capture, issuing bread according to temporary ration scales for troops and essential workers. Procurement commissions surveyed elevators and mills, recorded damage, and determined which installations could resume minimal output. In many localities, milling restarted on small stones or repaired roll stands long before elevator galleries were rebuilt. Seed inspection teams confirmed reserves, compared them with sowing calendars, and issued emergency loans from regional stocks to meet spring or autumn planting windows. Priority was given to seed grain and draft animals. Livestock counts were used to derive fodder allocations for collective and state farms. Urban systems had to be rebuilt alongside military supply. In recaptured Kiev, 6 November 1943, and later in Kharkiv, 23 August 1943, following a brief reoccupation, municipal authorities reinstated ration cards for workers in utilities, transport, and reconstruction brigades. Power supply remained irregular, so bakeries adopted shift schedules dependent on local generation or on small boiler plants. In Minsk, liberated 3 July 1944, flour arrived first by road and then by repaired broad-gauge rails from the east. Ration scales were set for garrison troops and factory workers, with lower scales for dependents until surrounding districts could deliver. Urban queues persisted, with weight variations recorded in daily postings when flour trucks were delayed by bridge repairs. Displacement and captivity changed the structure of demand. As German fronts contracted, civilians moved westward or hid in rural districts to avoid combat. After reoccupation, displaced persons and returning evacuees increased urban populations before housing and food systems stabilized. Prisoner of war camps multiplied on both sides of the line at different times. In late 1943 and 1944, German camps in remaining occupation zones and Soviet camps for captured Axis personnel required dedicated kitchens and regular allocations. Camp rations, set by internal regulations, were adjusted by availability and transport. Each new camp or hospital drew from the same constrained stock of flour, meat, and fats that supplied garrisons and cities, forcing administrators to rebalance deliveries by day. Infrastructure damage fixed ceilings on what could be moved. Bridges across the Dnieper, Berezina, and Pripyat required interim ferries and temporary spans, which reduced wagon cycles. In many districts, tracks were serviceable only at reduced speed, and single-track operations with block movement lowered daily train counts. Grain and flour often moved in smaller packets by road until rails reopened. This raised losses from spillage and increased fodder consumption by draft animals. To conserve capacity, authorities placed field bakeries close to front and construction brigades, converting part of the flow into bread near the point of consumption rather than hauling flour further. Agricultural recovery proceeded with mixed timelines, where sowing windows in 1944 were missed because of combat or delayed seed loans. Output in that year fell, and procurement targets for 1945 were adjusted downward. Where spring seed and minimal fuel for tractors or horses were available, harvests resumed on reduced acreage with a higher share of manual labor. Threshing relied on repaired belts and bearings. When these were unavailable, hand flails bridged gaps at the cost of higher losses. Veterinary services reported draft animals below pre-war weight, which limited cartage length. Procurement agencies accepted higher moisture content in emergency deliveries. Then, increased redrying losses at depots, which were logged as percentages in district reports. Security conditions persisted after front lines moved west. In Belarus and northern Ukraine, partisan formations shifted from interdiction to support of reconstruction and supply security, while scattered armed groups continued to tax road convoys. Soviet internal security units reimposed controls on private trade near railheads and depots to keep flour within official channels. Curfews and pass systems remained in place for months in some districts, shaping market activity and labor mobility. German-held pockets or bridgeheads until mid and late 1944 imposed additional guard demands on both sides of adjacent lines, diverting personnel from harvesting and milling at key moments. Humanitarian pressures appeared in predictable patterns. In newly liberated districts, households reported depleted seed, missing tools, and damaged ovens. Emergency measures included communal kitchens for workers on rail and bridge repair, prioritized rations for hospital staff, and targeted distributions to families with children through local committees. In remaining occupation zones, market regulation tightened as delivery arrears accumulated. When supply interruptions occurred, because bridges were closed for repair or wagons were diverted, urban authorities announced temporary reductions in daily bread weight with an intention to restore scales when backlogged trains arrived. Comparative quantities illustrate the constraints of withdrawal and reoccupation. A city of 200,000 required flour inputs on the order of several hundred tons per week to maintain ration bread scales. Bridging a single destroyed rail span could reduce arrivals below that threshold for days, and road haulage could not fully compensate. A field army on the move with 200,000 to 300,000 personnel and thousands of horses consumed hundreds of tons of bread grain equivalents and fodder per day. Withdrawal along single-track lines with ferry crossings could not simultaneously meet these needs and evacuate significant food stocks. Where both armies contested crossings, dispatchers prioritized ammunition and engineer stores, delaying food consignments and producing short-term ration reductions recorded in unit logs. By winter 1944-45, the immediate aftermath had settled into a different administrative landscape. German authorities west of the Vistula focused on provisioning fronts and selected garrisons. Exports from the remaining occupied districts of Belarus and Ukraine had ceased. Soviet procurement integrated recaptured territories into all Union plans, assigning quotas scaled to damage capacity, and providing seed loans and tool repair to increase 1,945 output. Urban ration systems continued with adjustments as rails reopened and mills restarted. For rural households, the balance of subsistence combined official deliveries, seed retention for the next planting, and kitchen garden output. The end of occupation did not immediately restore pre-war consumption patterns. Instead, both soldiers and civilians operated within ration frameworks that reflected the repaired length of a bridge, the number of serviceable wagons, and the weight of seed actually in barns before the next sowing date. The war's end recast a system built on seizure into a record of institutions, ledgers, and testimonies. In legal forums from 1946 onward, German food and economic officials described the rationale of Spring, 1941 memoranda and the chain that linked the economic staff east, the four-year plan offices, and army quartermasters. Herbert Back's writings and minutes were examined for intent and mechanism. The ministry's trial bundled economic policy with occupation practice. The picture that emerged placed the food program within a wider structure of war planning, finance of the campaign by occupation revenues, rationing in the Reich calibrated to imports that no longer arrived, and an expectation that Ukrainian and Belarusian harvests could be redirected by command. Military witnesses detailed how field bakeries, depot recipes, and rail priorities converted policy into daily grams of bread per soldier, while civilians from occupied districts provided household perspectives on quotas, inspections, and the arithmetic of seed, fodder, and survival. Post-war statistical offices and commissions reconstructed agricultural output and losses at regional scales rather than single villages. They traced how harvest shortfalls in 1941 and 1942 followed from disrupted cutting, missing fuel for combines, and elevated drying losses, how seed depletion lowered 1942 and 1943 yields in districts with heavy requisition, and how draft animal losses reduced cartage capacity even when fields were sown. Procurement tables from recaptured territories were compared with pre-war baselines to estimate recovery trajectories. Some right bank oblasts reached partial pre-war grain output by 1946 to 1947 with higher labor inputs and lower mechanization. Belarusian mixed farm districts recovered more slowly, where bridges, mills, and barns remained damaged. These reconstructions tied local experience to national bread supplies, showing how missing tons in one harvest propagated into ration scales 2 seasons later. In Germany and Austria, ration reform and currency stabilization after 1948 ended the wartime administrative regime, but did not erase its imprint. The wartime belief that victory in the East would ease domestic scarcity was replaced by a post-war consensus that stable food supply depended on trade, reconstruction, and yield increases rather than seizure. Agricultural policy shifted toward fertilizer, mechanization, and land consolidation, with research institutes measuring moisture tolerances, milling yields, and grain loss percentages in controlled conditions, the same variables that wartime officers had tracked under duress. The Bundeswehr's later logistics manuals retained the lesson that bread and fodder cannot be assumed from the landscape. They must be planned within transport and protection constraints. For Ukraine and Belarus, the legacy combined demographic loss, damaged infrastructure, and altered agrarian institutions. Collective farms and state farms were reorganized under post-war plans. Seed loans and livestock replenishment programs were formalized. Elevator networks were rebuilt with fire safety and drying capacity requirements informed by wartime failures. The memory of occupation quotas and inspections influenced local attitudes toward procurement well into the 1950s, shaping how households evaluated official targets and how local administrators balanced seed and delivery. In urban centers, the reopening of mills and the stabilization of ration scales became milestones in municipal histories, aligned with bridge completions and rail reopening dates that determined flour arrivals. Historiography developed along several lines. One thread examined intention, the degree to which planners in 1941 foresaw starvation in severed Soviet urban centers and incorporated it into their calculations. Another assessed capacity, how much of the projected surplus could be realized given rail conversion rates, bridge outages, and labor availability. A third traced adaptation, the shift from seizure to barter incentives, the standardization of moisture sampling, and the move from seasonal to quarterly targets. Comparative studies place the Eastern occupation alongside other resource polities, analyzing how occupation administrations converted territory into fiscal flows and how resistance, partisan warfare, and Allied offensives increased the guard and escort cost per ton moved. Evidence from multiple sides supported a multi-perspective record. German quartermaster logs, Soviet procurement ledgers, and village notebooks agreed on certain constraints. When belts and bearings failed, threshing slowed. When single-track rail with block movement replaced double-track, daily trains fell. When horse teams lost condition, fodder claims grew. When bridges were down, flour could not reach city ovens at planned weights. Testimonies diverged on intent and on the balance between policy and contingency, but converged on the role of infrastructure and timing. The harvest window in August-September, the freeze that permitted certain road hauls, the spring sowing calendar, these fixed points anchored narratives that might otherwise have drifted into abstraction. The war also left institutional memory about measurement. Moisture percentages, ash content, and milling extraction rates, once battlefield variables, became standardized peacetime metrics. Ration scales, grams per day by duty category, migrated into civil defense planning and disaster relief protocols. Security doctrines developed under partisan pressure informed later rail protection practices, block movement, checkpoint spacing, and repair reserves of timber and spikes. These continuities show how a system designed for wartime seizure generated administrative routines that outlived the occupation. Debate persists about counterfactuals. Could different allocations of sacks, guards, or rail priority have produced larger exports without sharper civilian contraction in 1941 to 1942? Could relaxed quotas in seed-poor districts have raised 1,943 output sufficiently to offset earlier gains? Could earlier investment in river transshipment have reduced rail losses? Such analyses underscore the dependency graph that the war exposed. Bread at the front or in a city queue was never only a function of acreage. It was the outcome of linked elements: labor, seed, draft animals, belts, sacks, wagons, locomotives, bridges, each with its own failure modes and repair times. The legacy for historical understanding is therefore technical and human at once. The hunger plan and subsequent grain seizures demonstrate how strategy, logistics, and rural economies interacted across borders and seasons. Soldiers measured rations in grams, civilians counted seed in sacks and fodder in stacks. Administrators balanced ledgers against trains that did or did not arrive. When the fronts moved, the arithmetic changed, but the variables did not. The long-term significance lies in this continuity. Campaigns designed around food supply must reckon with infrastructure, calendars, and the capacity of households to adapt. The record left by Ukraine and Belarus between 1941 and 1944 allows those mechanics to be quantified and compared without assigning moral labels, producing a study in how economic policy, military need, and rural labor combined to shape who ate, who planted, and what could be moved across a damaged network from one harvest to the next.